If you had the power of God, would there be anything that you couldn't do? And if you did have the power of God, what would you do with it? I'm George Roper with Authentic Faith. Today's verse will be Ephesians chapter 3, verses 16 through 17. And here Paul says, I pray that out of his glorious riches he may strengthen you with power through his Spirit in your inner being, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith. And so, if we're strengthened with the power of God, just imagine what kind of limitations that erases. What is it that we are now capable of in terms of self-doubt, in terms of enduring some of the problems and difficulties that we have, in terms of feeling overwhelmed, not just by our own problems, but the problems of others perhaps that we care about, the problems of others who are in our responsibility, be it our children, our parents, if we're caring for them in their older age, dealing with relatives, family members that are sick, and you have to watch them go through difficulties and deal with medical issues, and that affects you as well, and you can just become so overwhelmed. With the strength of God, one is able to cut through this, get through this, feel encouraged, feel empowered, have a sense that God has a plan for you, is looking out for you, and is going to help you get through these challenges. And so we look at our problems and we look at our difficulties, and we do rely on the strength of God to save us when we can't save ourselves, to save us in the sense of how we see ourselves when we can't see a way out, or we can't see ourselves in a positive manner. That strength of God makes it so that we could see that we have value, that we have a purpose, that we can be successful. All again with the strength of God as it relates to our faith in God and what God can accomplish. Certainly, this is what we can take away from these scriptures, from these two verses, and it indeed is true. However, what I'd like to do is now take these same scriptures and plug it back into context. And so when we look at the book of Ephesians, we see Paul writing, as he does throughout the New Testament. He's writing to certain congregations and areas that were in Asia Minor at the time, after it had been exposed to the gospel, as the men and women that had been exposed to Christ and his teachings began to spread out and inform others of what Christ had accomplished. And so we find Paul writing to a particular congregation. At this period of time, he is incarcerated. He is in jail, and he's reaching out. Now remember, many books of the Bible did not have titles. Certainly many of the letters and epistles that were written, they didn't come with titles. That was added on for convenience and organization. And so we see the book of Ephesians with the title Ephesians. However, chances are, and many scholars have debated this and lean towards the fact that Paul was not actually writing to the Ephesians. You see, when you read Acts and you become familiar with the missionary activities of Paul, he actually lived in Ephesus for some time. So he's now writing to the Ephesians, and he's acting like he doesn't know them and they don't know him, which makes people think he's not writing. This book was not to the Ephesians. This is a title that is not appropriate. There are considerations and thoughts about who he may have been writing to, or Perhaps this just was a letter that was circulated to the many churches in the area. Again, that's not my purpose today, but I did want to mention that. Nevertheless, he is writing to one of the congregations in the area of Asia Minor. And remember, Paul, for the most part, worked with the Gentiles. And oftentimes he had to deal with some of the friction that would occur between the Jews and how they held to their customs and their culture as they converted to see Christ as the Messiah, and how the Gentiles had now entered the faith, and there would be clashes with the Jews and the Gentiles as opposed to what was expected of the Gentiles, that they were going to participate fully in some of their ritualistic customs, the Jews I'm speaking of. And in terms of who was better, sometimes the Jews would express an attitude of superiority and vice versa. You had many Greeks that thought they had the superiority of intelligence on their side. And so a lot of these clashes would come into play. In this instance, when you look at the first two chapters and the beginning of chapter 3, Paul had been expressing how he, one, was in jail, and two, he was in jail because of the efforts that he had been making in spreading the gospel amongst the Gentiles. And he began to clear up the fact that he held no ill will against the Gentiles, that it wasn't their fault that he was in jail. He was in jail because he chose to embark upon this activity, and he was thankful that God would use him in that way. And he acknowledged that he was the least deserving of any degree of status in terms of how he was viewed, because remember, once upon a time, he actually worked against those that were in lockstep with Christianity, with seeing Christ as the Messiah. And so now here he is, a supporter, having changed from his past behavior in oppressing those that were practicing the way of Christ. He goes on to say that in his present state, that he was praying for the Gentiles to have exposure to that power of God, the power of God that was making it so that the Gentile minds could now be opened up to what God was doing, just the same as the Jewish converts. And so the understanding of what Christ had accomplished in dying for the sins of all mankind, and making it so that his life paid the debt, the penalty of sin, making it so all mankind could be re-engaged with God and worked with by his Spirit to have their minds transformed into the mind and thinking and attitudes of God, and ultimately be born into the same status that Christ now holds as he was resurrected. So all those that follow in his footsteps would also be resurrected, just as he is the first fruits of many to be resurrected, so others will follow like him. He is our elder brother, and we too would eventually mature and graduate into a position where we would be born in to the spirit realm, the spirit level, a spirit composition, having a spirit body, seeing Christ as he actually is, and being like him. And so this is what Paul is referring to, that he's thankful that the Gentiles have now had their minds open to this process. And he expressed to them that he was praying that they too would have the power of God that enabled them to understand that, but the power of God that would also enable them to develop other attributes that God has to offer, to develop the fruits of the Spirit that the Gentiles would now be able to process in their character, and that power of God would be equal to, if not more, than the power that had been shared with the Jews in their conversion, in their change, in their embracing of the Messiah, and the understanding of the things that Christ had accomplished and would accomplish in the future. So that's the context. And this power would be manifested, would be made available because of the faith that these Gentiles had. And keep in mind, faith is more than just believing. Faith is connected to action. Because you have faith, you behave a certain way. You look to God because you believe in him and what he says. You then seek to live a certain way, live by his laws, live by his ways, and not live or pursue a sinful life as an expression of your faith. And so this is what Paul was saying in context. And initially, what had been said, what I stated about the power of God and the solace that it can give us is true. But when we look at what Paul is saying in context, that is also true. And there's also something there for us to take away and dwell on and understand. That power of God is more than just affecting our physical lives, our physical bank accounts, our physical status. No, it's affecting the very insides of us as we become more like God, as we use God's Spirit to become more like God, as we use God's Spirit to enable us to obey him, to follow and keep his ways, and grow and mature spiritually. I'm George Roper with Authentic Faith.